Good morning, biology students. We are in week 2 of closure mode and online learning. So I wanted to make a lecture for you, and you have some notes that are on Classroom 2, so you can open those up and fill them out as we go along. We're talking about evolution now, and the reason this comes next is because we've talked about DNA, and when DNA has mutation, then it can change the trait. And when there's a new trait, you can have a change in species over time. So before we get to that, though, can be kind of a controversial subject for some people. And I want to be really clear about what science does. So science studies things we can replicate and manipulate, like things we can actually physically touch. And in science, we make these observations, and then we make an inference. We make a conclusion based on that. And as the studies come in, as more and more observations come in and more conclusions come in, then we build kind of a theory that people believe is true. So anytime there's a leap into a feeling like love or morality, right and wrong, or something supernatural, that actually can't be tested by science, because those are not physical things that can be tested or replicated or manipulated. So I include this to remind you that when scientists and the media are saying things about religion, they're actually not speaking about science. Science does not test things that are outside of nature. It only tests nature. And so when we talk about evolution, we're going to look at some observations, some evidence, and then the inferences that lead to this theory of evolution. And that's really all I can say. It's just looking at the material things and making conclusions from it. So here's the question for now. Are traits acquired? The traits that are acquired during your lifetime, do they get inherited? So for instance, if you have 2 adult mice and we cut off their tails and we mate them, will their offspring have tails? And then if we do it for 60 generations, will they still have tails? If you answered yes, they'll have tails, you're correct, because it doesn't matter if you cut them off, they still have the genetics to make tails. So we see this in people, that people have these customs that manipulate their body, that provide an acquired trait, a trait they got in their lifetime, and it doesn't get passed on. So some women in China, when they're just girls, will have their feet bound, wrapped really tightly to make these tiny little feet. And it breaks the bones and then they heal. But when they have offspring, they still have to bind their feet. It doesn't get passed on. There's women in Thailand who put these brass necklaces on and it actually stretches their neck out. That doesn't get passed on. There's people in Africa who have these gauges that they put like a slit in their lip or in their earlobe, and they increase the diameter over time, and it increases the skin in their lip. But that's not passed on either. And so the reason we say this, the reason I'm talking about this, is because the early theories on evolution were that one organism would change its traits. So like there was a short-necked giraffe, and it stretched its neck a little higher to reach food, and then it stretched its neck higher and got more food, and stretched its neck higher and got more food. And this is obviously wrong for several reasons. One is, how does a giraffe grow its neck? But 2, that wouldn't get passed on. So the women in Thailand who stretch their necks out, their babies are still normal. And so that leads us to Charles Darwin. People were trying to figure out, why are there different species in the world? Why do they look differently? And Charles Darwin helped with that. So he went on a journey in 1831, a 5-year journey, down to South America, around South America to the Galapagos Islands. That's kind of the place he's famous for. And then he moved west all the way into the east and continued to move west and back to England. And the whole time he was collecting biological specimens and looking at differences along the way. And he came to some interesting conclusions. So one of the things he noticed were these different tortoises. So there's a bunch of islands in the Galapagos, and each island seemed to have a differently shaped shelled tortoise. And so we'll talk about why that is. you can probably guess at some of it, but these tortoises have a really low shell and these ones have a really high one. And if we look at the individual islands, the ones with the high shell are from the Hood Island. These ones are kind of an intermediate shell from Pinta, and from Isabella, they have a really low shell. So what would you guess about the plants? What plants are available to these tortoises on Hood? And what plants are available on Isabella? And what plants are available in Pinta? If you are thinking that the plants must be higher in Hood, you're right. And if the plants are low, like grasses in Isabella, you're right again. And so there's this connection between the food available and the tortoise shell. So Darwin noticed that and made him think. Also, he noticed all these finches, and all the finches seemed to be related. They looked really similar to these finches in the west coast of South America. And these finches had different eating habits, and they ate different fruits, and they hung out in different parts of the canopy or in the trees and bushes. And they all looked similar and had somewhat similar songs, but then also different. So close enough to make him wonder and different enough to also encourage that wonder. So that difference we call variation. And there's two types of variation, which we'll talk about. But a variation is just a change in appearance or a trait. And one type is called intraspecific. That means between the same species. So these tortoises, even though they look very different, are the same species. And the species means that they could mate and produce fertile offspring. There's also interspecific, and if you think interstate or international flight, that's between two different species. So if these are the same species, what makes their shell different? And if you are tempted to say the plants, you're getting a little further ahead. They're different because they have different genetics. And this one has the genetics to make it have a tall shell, and this one has the genetics to make it a low shell. And just like in people, just if you think about our classroom, people are all different. And so tortoises are all different too. Their shells will have different colors. They'll be slightly higher, slightly lower. And that's just a variation. And it becomes an adaptation when it helps them survive on a certain island. So this is a zebra. This is a wild ass. And you can tell that they are similar, but they are different species. So this sort of variation would be interspecific variation. Although you can tell they're similar enough that they're related. So when you have variation, when you have differences, some of those variations are an adaptation. An adaptation is a feature that allows them to survive better in their environment. And so this low shell helps them survive well on little grasses. And this high-backed shell helps them survive with tall plants. That's how it's an adaptation. It has to help them survive. So think about these. How are these variations adaptations? So if we look at the peacock, this tail, when this male peacock is trying to mate, it lifts its tail up like this and puts on a display. And so it's an adaptation because it helps it mate and therefore its genetics survive. Maybe you could see this chameleon here, but it's camouflaged. And so camouflage is a great example of an adaptation because they don't get eaten. Therefore, it helps them survive. A snail has a shell, and some organisms are not strong enough to break the shell. Therefore, they don't get eaten, and it helps them survive. A woodpecker, this is a pileated woodpecker, it has a really strong beak and a really strong cranium. So it can actually drill its head into the tree and pull out bugs. So the cranium and the beak, those are adaptations. It helps it find food and survive. So we're not going to do this. We're going to talk about the theory of natural selection. So this picture kind of demonstrates it. This is opposite. Remember I showed you Lamarck stretching his neck? We know that's not what happened. Instead, what happened is if we have some variation here, see this one's kind of short, this one's a little taller, that one's maybe in the middle. The ones that can eat survive. The ones that can't, they die. And so this little one is probably going to die. And later, generations later, we see still we have variations. The necks are a little bit longer just because the ones that had longer necks from before, they got to reproduce. And then every year, the ones with longer necks reproduced. And even here, if these ones have longer necks, they can get more food. They're more likely to reproduce. And then they have offspring with tall necks. And then it continues to go on until we have giraffes of today with tall necks. So Darwin has this theory of evolution can be broken down into 4 parts. Variation, that's differences in trait. And overproduction, that means that more organisms are born than can survive. So this is true of most creatures. A fish will have hundreds and hundreds of offspring, and maybe 10 of them will survive to adulthood. In that mass of offspring, in the overproduction, some of them will have a trait that helps them survive. And so another thing to think about is our fish in the fish tank, that I fed them the same amount, and there's one huge one and a couple big ones and some really, really small ones. That's variation. More in that tank than will probably survive. And there's an adaptation. Some of them grow really, really fast. They eat a little bit of food and they grow a lot. And some eat a little bit of food and they don't grow much at all. So over time, the ones that eat a lot of food and grow a lot, they will get to reproduce. And this descent, that means to move down, with modification means to change. And so that means the ancestors basically, no, not the ancestor, I'm sorry, the offspring will be different than their ancestors. So these offspring are different than their ancestors. If we continue to breed these fish, the offspring will be more likely to grow quickly than their ancestors were. So here's another example. We have these crows, they're eating beetles. They prefer the green beetles, and so they're eating them. Where does variation exist? Some are green and some are orange. What's responsible for that? It's just a mutation. It's just genes that make a difference in the way they look. Which one's favorable? The green or the orange? It's more favorable to be orange. They're more likely to survive. Therefore, being orange is an adaptation, just because the green are getting eaten. The unfavorable, that would be the green. So which variation is selected for? As in, which variation is selected to survive? And the answer would be orange. Which variation is selected against? That would be green. And so what we'll see over time is descent with modification, which means the population will change. And so we have only 3 orange. Now we have about half orange. Now we have all orange. So we have another term to talk about, and that's fitness. Which beetles were most fit? The orange ones. They were fit to survive. And so fitness means the ability to survive in a certain environment. Could this environment change so that orange is no longer fit? Yeah, what if the environment's green all of a sudden? What if it was just dry in the summertime and now it's green? That will change things. Okay, last part. We're going to talk a little more about adaptations. I want you to look at these organisms and I want you to just describe how they're adaptations. And I'm not going to give you the answer. These are orchids. So you'll notice that these orchids look like bees. And I'll give you a hint that they look like female bees and they actually smell like female bees, female wasps. Okay, how could a flower smelling like a female wasp be an adaptation? How could it help them survive? You've probably heard of these. There's a coral snake, which is venomous, and there's a king snake, which is not. They live in the same areas. So the variation is the color how is this the one that's not venomous? How is this an adaptation? Its color. And you can pick one of these three. They're all examples of camouflage. A toad, this is a caterpillar, and this is a stick bug. So how are those adaptations? So I want you to avoid, as we talk about evolution, I want you to avoid talking about need. So Lamarck, the person who was wrong that we started with, he thought that if organisms needed something, it would change. But that's not how things work. Traits only happen when there's a mutation, and a mutation is random. It doesn't happen because something needs it. So if you think about any of the things that organisms might need, a rabbit might need sharp claws to scare away a coyote, but it doesn't happen. They have mutations, random mutations that change their coat color, and they happen to be advantageous, but it's not because they need it. Traits come about because there's variation, natural variation from mutation. There's more organisms born that can survive. That's overproduction. And then some of those traits are helpful. They help them survive. That's called an adaptation. And then if it's so helpful, it might actually take over the population and become a really common trait. Okay, that's it for now. So take a look at Classroom and see what other 2 assignments you have this week. And stay safe. Have fun. I miss you guys.